New Year's Eve 2024 should have been a quiet night for me. My girlfriend, Kara, had invited me to a party, but I wasn't in the mood to socialize. I had just returned from a stressful business trip, and the idea of being surrounded by drunk strangers wasn't appealing. I told Kara to go ahead without me and decided to stay home with our dog, Max, a large, affectionate German Shepherd. Our house was a rental on the outskirts of a small town in Colorado, surrounded by dense pine trees. Snow had been falling steadily all day, and by the time night fell, the world outside was silent and blanketed in white. It felt like we were completely isolated, which was usually comforting, but that night it felt off. Around 10 p.m., Max started acting strangely. He paced the living room, his ears perked up, growling at nothing. I tried to calm him down, but his behavior only made my unease grow. "It's just the storm," I told him, though I didn't believe it myself. As I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, I heard a faint noise outside. It sounded like someone walking through the snow, slow and deliberate. My first thought was that Kara had come home early, but when I checked my phone, there were no texts or missed calls from her. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the front door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but swirling snow. Max stood by my side, growling low in his throat. Against my better judgment, I opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight outside. The porch was empty, and there were no footprints in the snow leading to the house. I shut the door quickly, locking it behind me. My hands were trembling as I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But Max's growling didn't stop. A few minutes later, the sound came again, this time from the back of the house. It was closer now, heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. I grabbed Max's leash and my phone, deciding it was time to leave. I wasn't about to wait around and find out what or who was out there. As I opened the front door to leave, I stopped dead in my tracks. On the porch, carved into the snow, were two words: "Stay inside." My breath caught in my throat. The wind howled around me, and for a moment, I felt completely paralyzed. Max barked loudly, snapping me out of my daze. I pulled him back inside and locked the door again, my mind racing. Who had written that? And why? I called Kara, but the call wouldn't go through. My phone showed no service, which made no sense. I'd never had trouble with reception before. I tried calling again and again, but each attempt failed. It was as if something was blocking the signal. The next hour was pure terror. Just before midnight, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from my flashlight. I heard the footsteps again, this time circling the house. Max barked and growled at the windows, his tail low and stiff. I crept to the living room window, peeking through the curtains. In the faint glow of the moonlight, I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and motionless, its features obscured by the shadows. I couldn't tell if it was a man or something else, but it was watching the house. The figure didn't move, but the sense of malice radiating from it was palpable. My heart pounded as I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. I grabbed a kitchen knife, knowing it wouldn't do much good against whatever was out there. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the house. Max bolted toward the kitchen, barking ferociously. I followed him, my flashlight illuminating a shattered window. Snow was blowing in, and the footprints outside led directly to the window. But there were no footprints leading away. I locked Max in the bathroom, afraid he might get hurt, and cautiously approached the window. The snow outside glistened in the moonlight, but the area beyond the window was empty. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that didn't sound human. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the source of the noise. Standing in the corner of the kitchen was the figure I had seen outside. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and I chose flight. I grabbed Max from the bathroom and ran out the front door, not stopping until I reached the neighbor's house down the road. I pounded on their door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The neighbors let me in and called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched my house and the surrounding area but found no one. They chalked it up to a break-in gone wrong, but I knew better. That thing in the house wasn't human. I didn't go back to the house after that night. Kara and I broke the lease and moved out of town. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night, but every New Year's Eve, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to ignore its warning. New Year's Eve 2024 was supposed to be uneventful. I had just returned to my hometown in Oregon after years of living on the East Coast. My parents were hosting a party, but I wasn't in the mood for the festivities. I told them I'd drop by later, but in truth, I just wanted to be alone. I drove out to my grandparents' old house, a place that had been empty since their passing a few years ago. It was familiar, quiet, and surrounded by the kind of forested solitude I craved. The house sat at the end of a long dirt road, shrouded by towering pines. Snow had been falling steadily all day, blanketing the driveway and muffling the world outside. The power had been restored recently after a storm knocked it out earlier in the week, but the house still felt old and lifeless. I had brought a few supplies, snacks, a thermos of coffee, and my laptop to pass the time. The first few hours were peaceful. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, its warmth spreading through the living room. Outside, the snowstorm intensified, and I felt a sense of security knowing I was tucked away in the middle of nowhere. But as the hours ticked by, that sense of comfort began to wane. It started with the footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The storm was loud, and the house creaked and groaned in the wind. But the sound was distinct, soft, deliberate steps crunching in the snow outside. I froze, straining to listen. They stopped just outside the living room window. I crept over to the window, careful to stay out of sight. The porch light cast a dim glow over the snow, but I didn't see anyone. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe, or a fox. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. Minutes later, I heard it again, this time from the back of the house. The footsteps were heavier now, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted me to hear them. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the back door, shining the beam into the woods. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the howling wind. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the deep snow. The air was freezing, and my breath came out in white puffs. The footsteps had stopped, but there were no tracks in the snow. That's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. The snow around the house was completely undisturbed. There were no footprints anywhere. I backed into the house, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I tried to convince myself that I was just hearing things. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. By 11 p.m., the atmosphere in the house had changed. The fire in the fireplace seemed dimmer, the shadows in the corners darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I closed all the curtains and tried to focus on a movie, but every creak of the house made me jump. Just as the clock struck midnight, the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. The only light came from the faint embers of the fire, which cast flickering shadows on the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. That's when I heard it, a loud knock at the front door. It was slow and deliberate, each knock echoing through the silent house. I didn't move. My phone had no signal, and the thought of opening that door made my skin crawl. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I stood frozen, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Then, from somewhere upstairs, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My blood ran cold. The house had been locked when I arrived, and no one else had a key. I didn't wait to investigate. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the front door. The wind hit me like a wall as I stumbled outside, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. As I reached the car, I glanced back at the house. The upstairs window was dark, but I could see a figure standing there, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. It was tall and motionless, its face obscured. It didn't move as I climbed into the car and started the engine. I drove straight to my parents' house, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't tell them what happened. I didn't want to ruin their night or sound crazy. But when I returned to the house the next day to collect my things, I found something that chilled me to the core. In the snow outside the front door were footprints. They led in a circle around the house, stopping at each window. But they didn't lead away. It was New Year's Eve of 2024, and I had just moved to a small town in upstate New York for a fresh start. I wasn't expecting much from the evening, just a quiet night in my new rental, unpacking boxes and trying to settle in. The house was an old colonial-style building, charming but in desperate need of some work. The landlord had assured me it was sturdy, though the creaking floors and drafty windows suggested otherwise. The snowstorm outside added to the eerie atmosphere. Heavy flakes blanketed the streets, muffling all sound. By the time night fell, the world outside looked like a frozen wasteland. I hadn't met any of my neighbors yet, and the isolation was beginning to feel oppressive. Around 9 p.m., I decided to take a break from unpacking. I made a cup of coffee and sat in the living room, staring out the window at the empty street. The glow of the streetlights barely cut through the swirling snow, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on the unfamiliar house and the storm. Then came the knock. It was faint, just a single, deliberate tap on the front door. I froze, my mug halfway to my lips. Who would be out in this weather? I set the mug down and walked to the door, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I opened the door a crack, peering out into the night. The porch was empty. The snow on the steps was undisturbed, no footprints leading up to the house. Confused, I closed the door and locked it, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But the knocking came again, this time louder, more insistent. I checked the peephole, but again, there was no one there. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the door. The house suddenly felt colder, the shadows in the corners darker. I decided to distract myself by unpacking more boxes, but the unease wouldn't go away. An hour later, just before midnight, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow of the storm outside. I fumbled for my flashlight, cursing under my breath. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind howling through the trees. I tried to find my phone to call the landlord, but it was nowhere to be found. I realized I must have left it in the car. I didn't want to go outside, but I had no choice. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit me like a slap, and the wind nearly knocked me off balance. My car was parked at the end of the driveway, barely visible through the snow. I trudged toward it, my boots crunching in the ice. As I reached the car, I heard a noise behind me, a faint, almost imperceptible scraping sound. I turned around, shining the flashlight toward the house. My breath caught in my throat. There, in the upstairs window, was a shadow. It was unmistakable, a tall, thin figure standing in the room directly above the living room. The curtains swayed slightly, as if someone had just moved them. I knew for a fact that I hadn't unpacked anything upstairs yet, let alone opened the curtains. Panicking, I scrambled to unlock the car, grabbing my phone from the passenger seat. I called 911, my fingers numb from the cold. The dispatcher assured me that an officer would be on their way, but it could take some time due to the storm. I didn't want to go back inside, but the idea of standing out in the storm was just as terrifying. I steeled myself and headed back to the house, locking the door behind me. The flashlight's beam shook as I scanned the living room, then moved toward the staircase. The air felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak under my feet echoing in the silence. When I reached the top, I turned toward the room where I'd seen the shadow. The door was slightly ajar, and cold air seeped out from the crack. Pushing the door open, I shined the flashlight into the room. It was empty. No furniture, no boxes, no signs of life. But on the frost-covered window, someone had drawn a smiley face with their finger. The edges of the frost were still melting, as if it had been drawn moments ago. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. My heart was racing, and I could barely think straight. I decided to wait for the police in the living room, knife in hand. The minutes felt like hours, and every sound made me jump. When the police finally arrived, they searched the house from top to bottom. They found no one. The snow outside was undisturbed, with no footprints leading away from the house. The officers suggested that maybe I was imagining things, the result of stress and isolation, but I knew what I had seen. The next morning, as I packed my belongings to leave the house for good, I found something that chilled me to the core. On the back of the bedroom door, scratched into the wood, were the words, "See you next year." I spent New Year's Eve of 2024 house-sitting for my friend Matt, who had recently moved into a fixer-upper on the outskirts of Boise, Idaho. The house was old, creaky, and located in an area that felt more like the middle of nowhere than the edge of a city. It had been an impulsive purchase on Matt's part, and he loved its character, but to me, it felt like the kind of place where bad things happened in horror movies. Matt was heading out to celebrate the new year with his girlfriend, and I had reluctantly agreed to stay and watch his house, and his two dogs, Bear and Bailey. The dogs were sweet but skittish, especially in the dark. I figured they'd be my only company, but as the night went on, I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. The evening started out uneventfully. I cooked myself some dinner, played with the dogs for a bit, and settled onto the couch to binge-watch a series. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the flimsy windows, and snow began to fall heavily. By 9 p.m., the house felt colder than it should have been, even with the heat cranked up. I grabbed a blanket and kept telling myself it was just an old house, drafty and unpredictable. Around 10 p.m., Bear started growling at the front door. It was a low, guttural sound that immediately put me on edge. Bailey, usually the more energetic of the two, cowered behind the couch, her tail tucked between her legs. I paused the show and listened, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I heard nothing, just the wind. But then, faintly, there was a knock. It wasn't a polite, rhythmic knock. It was slow and deliberate, almost as if someone was testing the door. I crept toward the entryway, trying to stay calm. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. I peered through the peephole, but the porch was empty. Shaking my head, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but Bear wasn't having it. He kept growling, his hackles raised, as if he knew something I didn't. I decided to double-check all the locks, starting with the back door. When I got to the kitchen, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The back door was unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it earlier. The door itself was slightly ajar, swaying with each gust of wind. My first instinct was to slam it shut and lock it again, but I hesitated. What if someone was still outside? Or worse, inside? I grabbed a kitchen knife and pushed the door open, shining my phone flashlight into the backyard. The snow-covered yard was undisturbed, no footprints or signs of movement. Still, I locked the door and checked every window and entrance, making sure nothing else was out of place. An hour later, the real terror began. Just before midnight, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from my phone and the faint glow of the snow outside. The dogs started barking, first at the front door, then at the windows. It was chaotic, their barks echoing through the house, and I struggled to calm them down. And then, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't inside the house yet, but they circled the exterior, crunching in the snow. I turned off my phone flashlight, hoping to stay hidden, and pressed myself against the wall, trying to see through the windows without being seen. The footsteps stopped near the living room window. I could barely make out a shadowy figure standing there, just beyond the glass. Whoever, or whatever, it was, it didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I held my breath, praying it would go away. But then, the figure raised a hand and began tapping on the window. The sound was slow and deliberate, like a metronome, and it sent chills down my spine. The dogs were going ballistic, barking and growling at the window. I mustered the courage to grab a flashlight and shine it outside, but by the time I did, the figure was gone. The only evidence it had been there were a set of footprints leading back toward the woods. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. Minutes later, I heard a loud crash from the basement. It sounded like glass shattering. I didn't even know the house had a basement. Matt hadn't mentioned it. Against my better judgment, I grabbed the knife again and crept toward the basement door, which I found slightly ajar. The dogs refused to follow me. They whimpered and stayed huddled near the couch, clearly terrified. I should have taken their reaction as a warning, but my curiosity, or stupidity, got the better of me. The stairs leading to the basement were narrow and steep, and the air grew colder with every step. When I reached the bottom, I found a small, cluttered space with exposed pipes and a single hanging light bulb. The bulb flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. In the far corner of the basement was a shattered window, snow blowing in through the broken glass. And next to it, etched into the frost-covered wall, were the words, "I'm already inside." My blood ran cold. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The dogs were barking wildly now, but they weren't facing the basement. They were staring at the hallway. I followed their gaze and saw something that made my heart stop. The shadowy figure from the window was standing at the end of the hall. Its face was obscured by darkness, but I could see its outline. A tall, thin frame that didn't quite look human. It tilted its head, as if studying me, before disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see where it went. I grabbed the dogs, threw open the front door, and ran into the snowstorm. I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's house, nearly a mile away. They let me in and called the police. When the officers arrived, they found the house empty. The basement window was still broken, but there was no sign of the intruder. They assured me it was probably just a burglar who fled when they heard me, but I knew better. There was something unnatural about that figure, something that still haunts me every time I think about it. Matt moved out of the house a few months later. He claimed it was because of renovation issues, but I think he knew the truth. Whatever was in that house wasn't finished with us. And every New Year's Eve, I can't help but wonder if it's still waiting for someone else to come inside. New Year's Eve of 2024 was supposed to be a quiet night for me. I had planned to spend it alone in my small cabin in the Colorado mountains, far from the noise and chaos of city celebrations. It wasn't unusual for me to choose solitude. I valued the peace that came with being disconnected from the world. But that night, peace was the last thing I would experience. The cabin, a modest structure with just 2 bedrooms and a small living area, sat at the edge of a dense forest. Snow had been falling steadily for days, blanketing the area in a thick, white silence. My only company was my dog, Max, a loyal German shepherd who rarely left my side. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, and the world outside seemed to freeze in time. Around 9 p.m., I started to hear the wind picking up. It howled through the trees, rattling the windows and making the cabin creak. I had heard storms like this before, so I didn't think much of it. I stoked the fireplace, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and settled into my favorite armchair with a book. Max lay at my feet, his ears occasionally twitching at the sound of the wind. An hour later, I heard a knock at the door. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the howling wind, but it was there. I frowned, setting my book down. No one should have been out here, not in this weather and not at this hour. Still, I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice firm but cautious. No answer. I hesitated, then slowly opened the door. The freezing wind rushed in, biting at my skin. There was no one there. The porch was empty, and the snow was untouched. I shined my flashlight into the trees, but saw nothing but swirling snowflakes and darkness. Uneasy, I closed the door and locked it, telling myself it was probably just the wind playing tricks on me. Max, however, didn't seem convinced. He was on high alert, his ears perked up and his eyes fixed on the door. He let out a low growl, a sound I rarely heard from him. "It's fine, buddy," I said, trying to calm him, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. Another hour passed. Midnight was approaching, and I tried to distract myself with a movie. But Max wouldn't settle down. He paced the room, occasionally barking at the windows. Each time I checked, there was nothing there. The storm outside was relentless, and the wind carried with it an eerie, almost human-like wail. At exactly 11:55 p.m., the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the fireplace. I grabbed my flashlight again and checked the breaker box, but everything seemed fine. That's when I heard it, a loud thud from the roof. I froze, my heart pounding. It sounded like someone, or something, had landed on top of the cabin. Max was barking furiously now, his growls echoing through the small space. I grabbed the shotgun I kept by the door and aimed it at the ceiling, though I had no idea what I expected to accomplish. "Get out of here!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The thud came again, followed by a scraping sound, as if claws were dragging across the roof. Max barked even louder, his eyes darting to the door. I backed away, keeping the shotgun aimed, and reached for my phone. No signal. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and Max's heavy breathing. I held my breath, listening intently. Minutes passed, and I began to think it was over. Then the door handle jiggled. I swung the shotgun around, my finger on the trigger. "I'm armed," I yelled. The jiggling stopped, but a moment later, the window next to the door shattered. I stumbled back as the freezing air rushed in. Max lunged at the window, barking wildly, but whatever had broken it was already gone. I peeked outside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. There were footprints in the snow, but they weren't human. They were long and narrow, with deep claw marks at the toes. The tracks circled the cabin, leading back to the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with Max, the shotgun resting on my lap. Every creak of the cabin and every gust of wind made my heart race. I waited for the thing to return, but it never did. The next morning, as the sun rose, I ventured outside to inspect the tracks. They led deep into the woods, disappearing beneath the snowdrifts. I followed them for a while, but the further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if every living thing had fled. I turned back, hurrying to the safety of the cabin. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had visited me that night was still out there, watching, waiting. I decided to leave the cabin for good, selling it to a local who assured me they weren't afraid of the legends surrounding the area. I never told anyone what happened that night, and I've never gone back to the mountains. But every New Year's Eve, I find myself thinking about those clawed footprints in the snow, and wondering if the creature still prowls the woods, searching for its next victim. It was New Year's Eve of 2024, and I had reluctantly agreed to babysit my niece and nephew for my brother and his wife. They were heading to a fancy dinner party in town, one of those end-of-the-year events they never missed. I didn't mind watching the kids, but spending New Year's Eve alone in a house that big, especially one I wasn't familiar with, wasn't exactly my idea of a celebration. Their home was in a secluded area on the outskirts of Minneapolis, surrounded by tall trees and fields blanketed in snow. The house itself was beautiful, modern, and spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave a perfect view of the icy wilderness outside. But the isolation made it unnerving, especially for someone like me, who was used to the city's constant hum. The night started off fine. The kids, Emma and Jake, were 5 and 7 and full of energy. We played board games, watched a movie, and by 9 p.m., I had successfully tucked them into bed. The house was finally silent. I made myself some tea and settled into the living room with my laptop to pass the time. Outside, the snow was coming down heavily, and the wind howled through the trees, making the house creak. Around 10:30 p.m., I started hearing faint noises upstairs. At first, I dismissed them, thinking it was just the kids moving in their sleep. But the sounds didn't stop. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My heart began to race as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs to check on the kids. I opened Emma's door first. She was sound asleep, her soft snores reassuring me. Jake's room was next. He, too, was asleep, curled up under a mountain of blankets. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe the house was just settling. As I walked back to the staircase, I heard it again, this time louder. A distinct creak, like someone stepping on one of the floorboards near the attic door at the end of the hallway. I froze, my pulse quickening. The attic door was slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness visible beyond. I had no intention of investigating, but I couldn't just ignore it. I tiptoed down the hallway, flashlight trembling in my hand. As I reached the door, I gently pushed it shut and turned the lock. Whatever was in there could stay there. I hurried back downstairs, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. An hour passed. Midnight was approaching, and the kids were still asleep. I tried to distract myself with a movie, but my mind kept drifting back to the attic. The wind outside had picked up, and the house seemed to creak with every gust. I checked my phone. No messages from my brother. Just as I was about to text him, there was a loud thud from upstairs. I shot to my feet, my heart pounding. This wasn't the sound of the house settling. It was deliberate, heavy, like something had fallen or been thrown. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept up the stairs, my breath shallow and quick. When I reached the top, the hallway was eerily quiet. The attic door was open again, wide open. Cold air wafted out, sending chills down my spine. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated the narrow staircase leading up, but I couldn't see anything beyond that. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. Suddenly, a loud crash came from behind me. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. One of the kids' bedroom doors had slammed shut. I ran to Jake's room, yanked the door open, and found him sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with fear. "Uncle Dan," he whispered, "someone's in the house." Before I could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, clutching her stuffed bear. "I heard it too," she said, her voice trembling. I grabbed both kids and ushered them into the master bedroom, locking the door behind us. My phone was in my pocket, but when I tried to call 911, there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell tower. I cursed under my breath and tried to think of what to do. Then we heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway outside the bedroom. They stopped right outside the door. "Uncle Dan," Jake whispered, "is it Santa?" I shook my head, holding a finger to my lips. The doorknob jiggled, then turned. I pressed my weight against the door, praying the lock would hold. The kids clung to me, their small bodies shaking with fear. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. I waited until I was sure the intruder was gone before opening the door a crack. The hallway was empty, but the attic door was